yeah, sorry. Am I gonna?
Oh, it's okay. You can just.
We are. No, we are. Welcome. That's okay. Would you mind telling us your name, where you're coming from, and your favorite animal, please?
Tony Baker from Results Educational Fund, and favorite animal, let's see.
Or one you respect, either or.
Spirit animal is a prairie dog.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent.
And I'm sorry for being late. Also, sorry I got a little bit ahead of.
Yes.
Well, I'm Liz Grant. I work for the Argonne Foundation based out of Washington, D.C. And welcome to today's panel. I think it's going to be an excellent conversation. Today we're going to be talking about education and conflict within the frame of uncertainty and its effects on the changing nature of society. I'm going to ask each of our esteemed panelists and colleagues to please introduce themselves, where they are coming from today, and then we will launch into the panel and then open it up for discussion. So please.
I'm Sandra Hadi. I'm based at the Lebanese Ministry of Education and Higher Education, and I'm the project coordinator of an initiative funded by the Japan International Cooperation Agency. But I'm not representing either entity here today. I'm here as an independent researcher. Just have to clarify that. I'm actually also an Oxford alumna, so it's really good to be back here after 4 years. So
Wonderful, thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Naseemah Mohamed. I'm a PhD student in Comparative International Education Policy at the Department of Education here in Oxford.
Thank you.
Great. My name's Aqeela. I work for the Aqeela Foundation in London as Strategic Partnerships Manager. Before that, I was in India for 3 years designing education and ECD programs, and I also used to study here in Oxford doing my master's and PhD.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I look forward to our conversation. Sandra, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Lebanon is home to a population of approximately 4 million citizens from 18 different sects. In order to ensure that all sects are politically represented, the Ta'if Agreement was reached to end the country's 15-year civil war. So it was from 1975 to 1990. So they established the constitutional democracy, which was based on power sharing among the different sects. So the parliamentary seats are divided across sects in a representative, proportionate setup. But while the 18 sects generally coexist peacefully, remnants of the civil war and sectarian tensions have yet to disappear. In the mandatory civic education classes that Lebanese students take throughout primary and secondary schools, they're taught to tolerate and accept others, to embrace their country's religious diversity, and to respect people of all religions. Yet, what students learn about in the curriculum, which incidentally has not been updated since 1997, is quite different from what they experience in their country politically, legally, and socially. To illustrate, political parties continue to employ sectarian rhetoric and incite fear of the other in order to establish their position as saviors for their electoral base. And they're going to protect others, their sects from other sects' aspirations of political control. And instead of unified personal status law for all citizens in Lebanon, the country actually has separate personal status courts for each sect, and it's constituted of members of the clergy. And then interreligious marriage is impossible unless you convert to your spouse's religion, because civil marriage is still illegal in Lebanon. So in a country where differences are marked at multiple levels, where sectarianism is rife, and where socioeconomic livelihood is dependent on the whims of political elite, the only thing that is certain is uncertainty. The Lebanese live in fear of an outbreak of another devastating civil war and are anxious about what political drama the future might bring. And the influx of over 1.2 million Syrian refugees since the onset of the Syrian crisis in 2011 has exacerbated these anxieties and has resulted in even greater tension, both on a religious and a nationality basis. Now, amidst this complex context, the Lebanese government had to establish a comprehensive crisis response plan as the host of the largest refugee per capita population in the world. With the influx of approximately 587,000 Syrians between the ages of 3 and 18, the education sector played a major role in the crisis response. In 2014, the Lebanese Ministry of Education and Higher Education established the Reaching All Children with Education strategy, which aimed to increase the enrollment of both Lebanese and non-Lebanese children in formal education. So they opened a second shift of afternoon sessions for non-Lebanese students in complete formal education. It's the same kind of curriculum They're completely integrated into the formal system. And they established also regulated accelerated learning programs to help non-Lebanese students kind of catch up and return into formal education. Under RACE 2, which is a 5-year plan for 2017 to 2021, and it was created with the international community, there are 349 Lebanese public schools that are operating a second shift for non-Lebanese students. And with Mehi's considerable efforts to increase access to education for both Lebanese and non-Lebanese school-age children, the number of students enrolled in Lebanese schools has actually more than doubled since the onset of the Syrian crisis. The ministry has realized numerous achievements, such as formulating an interministerial child protection policy in collaboration with UNICEF and the Ministries of Justice and Social Affairs, developing regulated non-formal education programs, and piloting cash and school feeding programs with partners in order to increase child retention in schools. Now, through my work in the education sector, I've learned that uncertainty is a main factor in parents' and students' concerns. Syrian parents and students are worried about their future. Are they going to stay in the same school? Are they going to return to their home country? Will they be able to readjust to the curriculum in Syria, knowing that in Lebanon, students learn maths and sciences in either French or English, whereas in Syria, everything is taught in Arabic? But Lebanese parents and students were also worried about their future. So will the Syrians continue to outnumber the Lebanese in public schools? Will the Syrians ever leave? And if the Syrians do leave, will international donors and NGOs stop funding the schools? And will the public school registration fee waiver be stopped once the Syrians return to their country as well? So with the opening of this second shift in public schools came the inception of inter-shift rivalry. How am I doing on time?
You're doing great.
Good. The students are competitive and sometimes violent, not only on a nationality basis where it's like Lebanese versus non-Lebanese, but also on a shift basis. So I've learned that Syrians who have lived in Lebanon for several years, because we've had Syrians that were migrant workers in Lebanon, so they've been there since before the crisis, or even Syrians who moved early on in the crisis, they've been fully assimilated into the culture. But these Syrians are enrolled, most of them are enrolled in the first shift with Lebanese students because they were there not as refugees, but just as immigrants. But some of them tend to patronize the new Syrians or those who moved after the crisis. So inter-shift violence and hostility are not uncommon concerns among schools. So some schools have even resorted to separating the entrance and exit of the first shift and second shift in order to avoid fights and disputes between students during the shift change process. However, complete separation might not be the best solution. Principals who created joint activities for both the morning or first shift and the afternoon or second shift did notice that relationship between the shifts have improved significantly. So students from both shifts usually do not meet except during that shift change process, unless the entrance and exit are separated, which is, as I said earlier, the case in a lot of schools, and in which case they don't meet at all, so there's no interaction. But through joint activities, whether something as simple as attending supplementary study sessions during the weekend or going on a field trip to another city together, the students came to realize that their similarities far outweigh their differences, and that inter-shift friendships are just as easy to foster as same-shift friendships. And students' concerns and worries about students in the other shift were diminished, and their prejudices were proven wrong. So in a country where uncertainty is the norm, education plays a key role in alleviating the ramifications of constant uncertainty on students and in responding to the effects of any changes, whether minor developments or major crises. It is our duty then as academics, policymakers, and education professionals to think about what that role would encompass. How can we provide students with the psychosocial support that they need in order to navigate the tumultuous environment of the country that they live in? How can we make sure that uncertainty does not push students into finding comfort in similarity and rejecting diversity? And what steps need to be taken to ensure that violence in the battlefield is not translated into hostility in the school playground, and that political conflicts do not translate into classroom aggression? How can we ensure that increased unemployment in Lebanon does not turn into a blame game, with refugees often used as a scapegoat? Years of mandatory civic education do not seem to have made a significant impact on sectarianism in Lebanon, and many students continue to uphold sectarian values. Simply telling students to accept others from different nationalities or teaching them content about diversity will not suffice. Creating activities that bring together Lebanese and non-Lebanese students, parents, and even local community actors might be a good start towards acceptance and coexistence. Lebanese curricula need to be updated to suit the present context, and there should be more emphasis on diversity, tolerance, and acceptance through more relatable content and active learning, as opposed to just dry material and lecturing, the whole chalk and talk technique. For impactful and long-term change, this should be coupled with steps towards improving Lebanon's political formula and legal system, understanding the economic situation of the country and identifying solutions, and implementing nationwide projects to fight sectarianism and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we define education as primarily let me start again. If we define education as a primarily formative process, that is one that gives individuals the tools to interpret, evaluate, and ultimately to shape society, we quickly realize that the relationship between education and conflict cuts both ways. We can educate to create a more plural, tolerant, and peaceful society, or the exact opposite. So my presentation will highlight how historical events, particularly those of social upheaval and conflict, impact institutions and societies long after the events themselves have been erased, forgotten, or in the case of Zimbabwe, have been censored. I argue that in order to create just, plural, and stable societies, we must create policies that take into account and bravely address the legacies of conflict present in each one of our societies. So in my research to do this, I've tried to highlight the importance of historical analysis and oral histories for both understanding and positively shaping educational systems and their societies. I looked at the ways in which a highly censored conflict in the 1980s in Zimbabwe, my home country, not only affected the learning processes in the schools for decades, but also the formation of national, ethnic, and political identities in these school communities. The resulting political tribalism and ethnic nepotism continues to shape the country today. So, for the population of Matabeleland, the place where I'm from, in Zimbabwe, it's in the southern part of the country, the educational crisis began 3 years after the War of Independence. In late January 1983, Robert Mugabe deployed 5,000 North Korean trained 5th Brigade troops to predominantly Ndebele-speaking regions of Matabeleland and Midlands on the pretext of putting down a rebellion of dissidents. The mission was called Kukurahundi, which is a Shona word for the rains that sweep away the chaff. The chaff, of course, being the members of the oppositional party, the Zimbabwe Patriotic Union, which fought alongside Mugabe's party during the War of Independence. So before 1965, both Mugabe's party and the opposition party were one complete party. They fought the War of Independence together. However, over time, a political split that largely occurred along ethnic lines separated the two parties. So after the War of Independence, Mugabe's party won. He hired the 5th Brigade and sent them into the south to get rid of the oppositional party. But because it was along ethnic lines, the 5th Brigade didn't make a distinction between party members and the local population. Up to 10,000 people were massacred. Many more ran away into South Africa. There was large rape and torture. And the government imposed martial law and effectively hid the atrocities from the rest of the country. I was born 2 years after the massacres ended, and I never knew about them until I was a college student at Harvard University. Mm-hmm. Nobody had told me about them at home, even though an aunt had passed away and been killed by the 5th Brigade. And people were too scared to talk about it. It is de facto still dangerous to discuss Kukurahundi. Although our new president, Ernest Mnangagwa's role in overseeing the massacres, he oversaw the massacres at the time, has re-energized efforts now to raise the issue in the public. So while the massacres ended in 1987, when Mugabe's party signed the Unity Accord, the educational effects still linger. So I went in and I interviewed people who were students, policymakers at the time, and teachers and community members about the educational effects of the massacres. The most pronounced way in which the conflict disrupted education was that the first way is that the soldiers targeted males between the age of 16 and 60. Under the guise of looking for dissident combatants, they killed thousands of young men. And if you talked to the communities, they said that you would not be able to, within the years of the massacres, you wouldn't be able to find males between the age of 16 and 60 at home. They were either taken away or they had to flee for their lives. The imposition of martial law decimated the economy of the region, leading to store closures, food embargoes, travel bans, that meant that parents couldn't afford to pay school fees for their children. Teachers who were considered community leaders and who often had military or political backgrounds from the War of Independence were intimidated, brutalized, and murdered throughout the region, which led to, of course, school closures. Many of the minority Ndebele teachers in the post-independence period had fought in the war, and they were actively teaching Marxist and socialist theories in schools when they were targeted by the 5th Brigade. The physical presence of the soldiers and the violent atrocities they carried out made it difficult for students and teachers to concentrate. And of course, the soldiers used schools as political theaters for power. Schools are political tools in as much as they are educational tools. And so often they would gather the community and commit atrocities within the schools. There's still mass graves in the schools to today. But we can talk about the short-term effects, which I'm sure we're all well-versed in within the field. But I discovered from my interviews one of the more lasting effects that is not spoken about but has huge policy implications for the country. So one of the lasting effects has been the ethnic tensions it created between, of course, the Ndebele and Shona ethnic groups in the region. In the areas most affected, there's a deep mistrust of Shona people, or people from the north, especially teachers from the north, because when the soldiers came through, they all spoke Shona. So they assume that all Shona-speaking soldiers are loyal to Mugabe's government and party. So one of the government officials spoke to me in confidence, and she basically informed me that the region was suffering, still is suffering today, from a lack of trained teachers in Matabeleland. And the reason for this is because the community is so hostile to Shona teachers that Shona teachers don't stay in the community for long. And it's created a cycle of underdevelopment in the educational sector there, because the fewer qualified teachers come, the lower the educational attainment rates, which then feed into the system. So the education continues to decline in the Matabeleland region. So the resulting loss of teachers has created low quality education. The high attrition rates affect student outcomes and limit the number of professionals in the region who can fill the need. So despite deeply valuing the education for their children, the parents in the Ndebele region, they believe that the government is really carrying out a cultural genocide by sending Shona teachers. And the mistrust of the education system, while subtle, has a profound and lasting influence. We need the government to acknowledge the atrocities that its forces committed, and by allowing the voices of the victims to be heard, the ethnic divisions can begin to be ameliorated. Some might argue that history is always a construction of the present. But while history that we teach in classrooms may change the interpretation of an event, it can't erase the legacy of what happened. The truth leaves traces and has effects. The greater distance between what we construct in our classrooms and the facts themselves, the graver the consequences. We can't effectively deal with historical legacy of events of whose existence we are unaware. As we speak, and this is now more broadly to today's context, the College Board in the US, one of the largest nonprofits that administers the AP placement classes and tests in the US history, plans to eliminate all pre-1450 history from its curriculum. This Eurocentric whitewashing of history of North America is dangerous, and it will eventually eliminate all traces of pre-European civilizations, with them the knowledge and traditions of those civilizations in their own right, and impact global identities and group formation, just like we saw in Zimbabwe. Another news feed that popped up was Israel and Myanmar have recently signed an agreement to collaborate on the teaching and recording of each other's history. Both of these countries have been accused of numerous human rights violations and ethnic cleansing, and seem to be creating alternative histories based on these alternative facts. I understand that this might sound strange coming from an educationist, but the danger of an all-encompassing global education system is that with a concerted effort, the system that we have now, which is everywhere, is that with a concerted effort, they have the power to erase their own erasure. And all of us, both the erasers and those erased, will suffer the consequences of this historical truth, just as in the case of Zimbabwe demonstrates. Thank you.
I'm going to check the time before I start talking. Essentially what I'm going to talk about is my research that I conducted for my PhD. And the genesis of that was, as you can see from the conversations that we've been having, that we tend to turn towards education to solve most of our problems, whether it's political, economic, or we need to fix this, and we need skilled workers who are in this way. So we tend to turn towards education. And so even when conflict happens or violence happens, we tend to again look at education systems in schools and say, oh, we need peace education, we need life skills, we need conflict resolution. So the question that came to me in my head was, well, exactly what are schools doing in situations like this? And so I conducted my research in Kenya after the 2007 post-election violence, which Alice spoke about earlier this morning. And I I did my research in Kericho and Nakuru in the Rift Valley of the Western Kenya. And I think I conducted around 90 interviews. I thought about how I should talk about this research, and I think the best way is to just tell you two stories about two schools that I visited in Nakuru. So in Nakuru, I went to one school that I had to travel to quite far outside of the city of Nakuru. And I came across, and I went to the school, and I went and I sat in the head teacher's office, and I was waiting there for at least 25 minutes for him to come, and then he walks and he's quite excited, and he's pouncing around the room and everything. A teacher comes behind him, they talk about something about the lunch or whatever is going on. And then he sits down and says, okay, tell me, what do you want to know? So we start talking about the violence and how it had affected the communities and the school that he's in, that he leads, the school leader. And he talks about, yes, that there were a lot of houses around the schools that were burned. There was a lot of people who fled. And in terms of, in the school, there was a teacher that was killed. There were students that were killed. There were people that participated in the violence. And that after the period of once the post-election violence had died down, it took a couple of weeks for things to normalize, because a lot of the families were starting to come back slowly and until he got largely where he should be in terms of his numbers in the school. And he said that what he would do is he would go around the school, and he noticed that his school wasn't exactly the same. He said the energy was very different, and things were, it was quite quiet, it wasn't as noisy, and people weren't talking. There were groups here, groups there, and everything. So he got the teachers together in a staff meeting, and he started to talk to them about, what happened? What are your stories? Tell me what's going on. And the first day, the arguments happening. You did this, and you did that, and you burned that, and this, and you burned down this. And he's trying to moderate those discussions. One teacher walks out and leaves, and okay, staff meeting dismissed. And the next day, he tries again. And he tries this, and they continue to have these meetings and discussions. And so over 4 days, he finally gets them to a point where they've sufficiently shared their stories with each other enough, and they've realized that they are both perpetrators and victims, and that together as a school and as a community, they have suffered. And then from then is where he starts to design how are they going to respond to all the issues that they're seeing in their schools, because you tend to see them much later as well. So he tells the teachers, go out there and tell me what are the problems. And so they list out everything that, actually a lot of the students, they're showing, post-traumatic stress, or they're not really speaking to each other, and so we need a little bit something to do with that, or I don't have enough resources because I've got more students coming into the school. because there was a lot of displacement. There were 600,000 displaced, and I don't have enough benches. I don't have enough. So they made this list, and they kind of allocated, like, I'll do this, and we'll go into communities and we'll find the resources and so on. He himself used to travel quite regularly to Nairobi, and he spoke to a lot of NGOs and churches, trying to convince them that my teachers need training on conflict resolution, they need training on life skills and so on. And he managed to get 2 of his teachers to go into Nairobi, fully paid, get the training and come back and then provide this training, and from that they created a peace club. They called it a peace club. It was essentially ways for the children to engage in sports, art. And the day I had gone, they were going to be planting trees in the next club that they were meeting. And so that was one school that I went to. Then another school that I went to, I walked into the school, the head teacher's sitting there, and he looks up at me, he says, "So what do you want to talk about? Like, what is this about?" So I explained to him, that I'm here to talk about violence and everything. And he says, yeah, there have been a lot of effects, and yeah, there was violence, and yeah, some of the teachers were affected. So I have to dig and try to get more information from him about what happened with the students. And yes, they were affected. Some of them, parents were killed. I have one whose sibling was killed. Okay. So how are you, managing this? And he was like, yeah, we've got a lot of displaced students come in, because he was more in the city, so they sort of a lot of the displacement camps were in the city, and so we've got a resource issue and so on. So he was like, yeah, I spoke to my teachers and we're trying to get resources, and so agreed. Like he made an effort. He got benches and so on. So then I asked him about and what about the teachers and students? And he said, yeah, everything's fine. You just have to keep them focused on the fact that they've got the examinations coming and so on. So I'm like, okay, can I speak to another teacher? And he said, yeah, when you speak to the counselor. So I walk to the counselor's room and I go around the corner, and she greets me as I meet her on the way, and I'm like, oh, can I speak to you? And she's like, yes, come in. She takes me to what seems like a cupboard under the stairs. So we enter, and there's piles of books, and there's a desk, and there's a chair, and for me to actually see her, because there's no light, we have to keep the door open, and so we have this conversation. I ask her, so what did you? She tells me these stories and how the students have been so affected by the violence, the post-traumatic stress that she's seeing. She told me a horrific story about how she figured out after many weeks that one of the girls was raped, that she had an infection, and she didn't realize soon enough. So then she mobilized resources from NGOs to get this girl to go into Nairobi for treatment. It was too late. They had to remove her uterus. Helping displaced students get, where do we put them with families, putting them in touch with families and so on, getting the resources. And she said, and I said, well, what about the teachers? And she said, yes, I know. I walk by and I see the teachers are just angry all the time. They tend to, specifically towards certain groups of students, she said, they'll say, you're stupid, go stand at the back of the class, and you're this. And she's like, I see them arguing, and I go and I try and tell them, no, you should not talk like that. And they're like, oh, you don't know, these ones are just stupid, and so on and so forth. And so I said, well, what sort of support are you getting? She was like, yes, there are some teachers who have been helping me in terms of gathering the resources. They understand. I went myself to local churches, because at the time in Kenya, the local churches do a lot. So they provided me some training on conflict resolution. She takes out a whole stack of papers that she's received. And I look through the papers with her, and in one place she's actually got a question mark on something. So I say, oh, what is this? And she said, oh, they told me that I need to do conflict resolution, and I need to talk to, we need to help students understand what it is and etc. But I didn't understand how to do that. So I said, okay. So she's like, but I try, and I try to, take the best out of this. I try to tell whichever teachers are interested and so on. So that was the 2 stories. And I think what I got out of those 2 stories was, one, teachers are not empty vessels. They are from the community they serve. They have prejudice. They have their own prejudices. They have their own biases. Sometimes they're perpetrators. Sometimes they're victims. And I think in post-conflict situations, or situations even now where there's politicization of identity all the time, and you can expect that teachers have some sort of thinking in their head as well. I think it's so important to look at teachers as individuals first, and let's try to deal with what is their own thinking around all of this, like ethnicity or identity or politics and so on, before we start telling them you need to do peace education or you need to teach our kids resilience, because they're not ready. They're not going to be imbibe those values or attitudes themselves. And the second thing I learned is while we do need to provide teachers with methodologies on how to teach, these things can't be taught in vacuum. You can't teach resilience in a vacuum. You can't teach adaptability in a vacuum or positive social relationships in a vacuum. It's so important to have a culture in the school that imbibes that, so that when students are living, working, breathing in those schools, they're actually seeing that everywhere. And I think that was the difference between the two schools. One had this really positive environment around, moving forward and helping each other, and one just didn't. It was absolutely lacking. And so yeah, that was my research. That's what I wanted to say. Those are the two takeaways I wanted to share for this panel.
And thank you for everyone who tuned in.